Good morning and welcome to the Life Expansion After 50 podcast. In today's episode, we continue our exploration of the unseen power of words. Last week, I invited you to identify a belief that may be holding you back in some way, something relatively minor, so you can practice learning the process with greater ease. Before we dive in, I want to emphasize that this isn't about mental health. My aim is to empower business-minded individuals, salespeople, leaders, owners to tap into more of their own agency and their personal leadership, and through that increased agency, unlock their untapped potential. Now, this mini-series I'm doing on the unseen power of words will guide you through a unique perspective on the stimulus response cycle. Why? Because I've taken the stimulus response cycle, and instead of it being just stimulus response, I've broken it into like 8 different dimensions that we go across. And we're starting with pre-stimulus, and it goes all the way to what I was talking about earlier, where if anything still gets through and we get triggered, we have the emotional modulation to take care of it from there. Today, we'll focus on what I call the pre-stimulus stage. And there's a few things in the pre-stimulus stage: priming, beliefs, stories. And today, although it's out of scope, I'll talk about our condition, which is related to conditioning. The mini-series will guide you through the unique perspective on stimulus response cycle. Today, we focus on what I call the pre-stimulus stage, and our topic for this episode is beliefs. Beliefs lead to stories, and stories lead to the words that we say to ourselves over and over. This is why it's said that life and death are in the power of the tongue. Getting a handle on our self-talk is an important milestone in designing that life that we'll love living. Most of our beliefs were formed before we turned 10 years old. You may have heard the saying, "You are what you were when you were 10." To understand this, think about the events and influences shaping our early years. For my generation, it might have been news headlines, while for Gen Z and Gen Alpha, it could be social media trends. This reflects the fact that much of our foundational conditioning happens between ages 0 and 7. Understanding this is important because as you work to break through perceived upper limits and elevate your life, you'll often find that resistance has roots in that early conditioning. That brings me to another key point. This podcast is centered around life expansion. By the time most people reach 30 and then on through 50 years of age, they've developed routines, living largely on autopilot, out of habit, repeating the past, living the past over and over, while at the same time yearning for a different future. Sometimes they give up on that dream. Imagine if there were a button that you could press to reset that early conditioning to better serve the life you're living now, or better yet, the life you dream of creating. That's what this work is about. The work we're doing together is that reset button. I wish I could tell you it's as fast and easy as a button, but compared to living the next half of your adult life the same as you did the last half, I think 3 to 6 months is a very nice trade-off. It becomes even more meaningful if you have a goal, dream, vision, or desire that's bigger than yourself, something that may have once felt out of reach. Now, if you're content with the status quo and prefer the comfort of the familiar, this content might not resonate as strongly. Why? Because if it's true that 95% of your life is driven by habit, then tomorrow will look a lot like today, and today like yesterday. If that brings you satisfaction, why put in the extra work? But let's consider the person determined to make the second half of their life the best half. Someone who is ready to do whatever it takes. For that person, there will be hundreds of thousands of new moments, brand new moments, unfamiliar, vastly different from the past, full of surprises and opportunities. In that case, living 95% of our life by habit won't really serve us that well. Instead, we'll need new habits, ones that help us thrive amidst volatility, uncertainty, complexity, and ambiguity, because in that space of VUCA lies access to infinite possibilities. Before I got on the podcast today, I was tagged in a post, and in this post, it talked about learning and development and whether or not we should be leaning into behavior change. And it was a very interesting topic. And it was shortly before I was coming on, and I made a quick comment, and then I said, you know what, I'll mention it here, and that's what I'm doing now. It's 𝗘𝗽𝗶𝗀𝗃, Burright, but in the comments, I'll put the link to it. Essentially, my response had to do with the fact that first we have to access our agency. I think people always have the agency. The question is whether or not we access it, right? We always have our potential, but do we access it? And in order to access that agency, I say we have to have personal leadership, right? We have to make that choice that we're going to lead our lives. And then through that choice, we can then do the things necessary to have agency. And from that point of agency, then presented with the references, we can decide whether or not we want to change our behavior, whether or not we want to change our values. And that was the specific point, I think, in the post. It was not just the beliefs, it's the values, because you start messing around with people's values and beliefs, that feels like it's crossing the line. But if they have agency and you present them with the references and they choose to make that shift or not, it's on them, and that's the way it should be. So the work I do is to give you that agency. In 7 Habits of Highly Effective People, he talked about making choice. You have to have agency to make choice. And that choice, you get a very, very short period of time to do it. Something like a quarter of a second, 250 milliseconds, if that. And if you're in a triggered state or a stressed state and there's cortisol already running through your body, if you allow your reaction to become your response, then you're already cooked before you start. The point that I would like to make relative to values and beliefs is that in this work, I always start with purpose. And I'll talk about it a little bit here, but one of the things I plan to talk about is how we get into this space of beliefs and stories and our existing conditioning. There's like a loop. And if you look at that loop, it's like a big, big pot of spaghetti that you're cooking, for a large number of people. And I tell you that there's one of those strands of spaghetti is actually artificial, but it looks the same as the other. Imagine going in and looking for it. That's kind of like what it feels like. But if you start with purpose, and you make the purpose bigger than yourself, and you accept the fact that you will do the inner work necessary to meet that purpose, then it takes that whole pot of spaghetti and makes it irrelevant, because we're starting from post that. That's why I won't work with anybody for free, because obviously it's very convenient, but I don't have the right to push against their resistance, because their resistance is coming from a place of survival, and it could be existential level, and we don't know what else is connected to it. But when they pay, that is my ticket to say they want this badly enough, and then it gives me the right to push through their inner resistance. Now, of course, they can always back out. They can always decide, I've had enough. But people will go through some pain. I mean, people cry, people freak out, people get mad and yell and scream, and then they send you a text, I'm really sorry, but because they're going through the cognitive dissonance that exists between the line that's above us that we can see. And when we go to cross that line, we enter into this new area of this new barrier of stories and beliefs and good experiences and bad experiences and trauma and violence and all this stuff that's in there. What the teacher said to me, 35 years ago, all that stuff is in here. And as we go into it, we're now pushing against doing something that we've believed most of our adult life that we can't do, that's not available to us. And in that, we get the cognitive dissonance. Just like excitement can have the same signature as anxiety. So as we go across that line, we may get excited. This is where sometimes they've been suppressing this belief that they might lose, and now this belief pops through that they might lose, because suppressing is not the way to do it, by the way. And in that moment, when this belief that is not available to them pops through, then it changes things. And that's what's happening in this cognitive dissonance. In the same way that if someone's working with the person with a phobia, the person has a phobia of snakes, as the person talks about snakes, if the phobia is strong enough, that person, they become the enemy just like the snakes, because they're trying to get this person to touch snakes. But to them, touching a snake is an existential problem. And I'm trying to get them to touch the snake. So that's why you have to do different techniques to take the subconscious out of play. And that's a big part of it. We're going to talk about that subconscious in a bit today, because it's an important point. Last week, I did this drawing, and this is a stimulus response. So if you can imagine, I started with just 2 boxes, stimulus and response. And then I made the point that it's not just stimulus response, it's stimulus reaction, choice, response. And then I made the connection that if we allow our response to equal our reaction, which I think happens largely as somebody who's over 50, I can tell you, I think that we're living 95% by habit. We're repeating things, right? And then because the habit, it fires over and over. And if you know anything about myelin and neurons, you know that with deep practice or intensity or duration or enough repetition, you get myelin wrapped around the neurons, and the neurons fire faster with more strength, precision, and accuracy. And then what happens is that they can bundle into what's called meta programs. So if you have a set of things that fire over and over, and this is why you connect. In James Clear, Atomic Habits, he talks about connecting the things you want to do with things that you're already doing, because there's a sort of a meta program kind of a view, but you're attaching it to something else that's very strong, very persistent, and it's going to be around for a while because it's become a meta program. So when you look at this stimulus reaction, this can become like a meta program for that particular stimulus, and stimulus cue, I'm using those interchangeably. And then you have choice, and then you have response. So if you make all this one thing, which can happen, in other words, my reaction, if I'm stressed, can be, like I said, a little over a tenth of a second, 150 milliseconds. If I'm stressed, that's what happens. If I let that equal my response, because my conscious mind hasn't even come online yet to bring in that logic and that experience and that wisdom, and now I'm deciding, I'm speaking, I'm potentially withdrawing, fight, flight, freeze, or faint. I'm maybe choosing to delay it. Maybe I'm just throwing up my hands and skipping it all together. The challenge with this is not the end of the world if you recognize that your habits are not yourself. Now, you've heard this before. You are not your behaviors. But your behaviors are your personality. So it's like, yeah, but, I don't really get that. If my behaviors are my personality, and my personality is who I am, then how can you say I'm not my behaviors? I can say it like this. Your behaviors are from your habits. That's the 95%. If I'm talking to a person and they say they want to stop smoking cigarettes, but then on the other hand, they keep smoking cigarettes, I cannot look at both of those entities as the same level. The one that says, I want to stop, and I can connect it to they've connected it to their purpose. They're paying to have the work done, whatever. I don't do that kind of work. But if they're paying to have that work done, then I can knowingly say that the person saying, I want to stop, is them. That's who they really are. The entity that's making them smoke is a set of habit patterns. And that entity is a physiological thing. It's a thing. It's not a being. The being is who's saying, I don't want to smoke. The thing is this network of neurons, the synapses, the neurotransmitters, dopamine and serotonin, this chemical cocktail that's working to get them to smoke cigarettes. So once we can separate it, now we can have a conversation. So what that has to do with this is, if you believe that your subconscious, which is the stimulus reaction, if you believe that that's your being, that's who you are, then you will double down on these things that it caused you to say or decide or do. You can experience this. You might remember this, where you're faced with something, you blurt out an answer, and then people ask you to justify the answer, and you do. You justify it, and then you fight over it. You double down on it, and then you write pieces about it because you are so committed. Cognitive bias kicked in, right? Consistency and commitment bias and confirmation bias. It's already told you, and now you think it's you, so you're thinking, my subconscious has kept me alive. It must know what it's talking about. This is what it made me say. Now I have to figure out what that means. And, they say, well, yeah, everything happens for a reason. So you back into what it means. But if I could get that person to pause and say, wait a minute, that's not me. I didn't mean to say that. And you can do that. You can literally say to yourself, cancel. I cancel that. And then restate what you really mean. And this will save you so much trouble in life, because who wants to spend their life defending something that came out of conditioning that happened 40 years ago? So that's why I say you are not your behaviors. Your behaviors may form your personality, but as you become a different being, your behaviors will change and your personality will then change. It's very, very hard to try to change it the other way, obviously. So this is what we talked about last week. No longer will we have the stimulus reaction equal the response. The stimulus reaction is a thing, and then there's a choice between here. So this is about a quarter of a second. This, you get about another quarter of a second, and then you have your response. Now, I talked about meta-programs. The meta-programs happen in here. But the other thing that happens in here is cognitive biases, and the cognitive biases are heuristic, and it's to speed things up for stuff that happens all the time. The thing that got my attention first with cognitive biases was Influence by Dr. Robert Cialdini. And then I started leaning into it because I saw how pervasive they were. The one that I see and I think is very easy to understand because it shows up in marketing, advertising, it shows up in, that's why we have conspiracy theories. Confirmation bias. Confirmation bias says that once we see something or believe something, that we will make other things fit that narrative. We'll automatically believe them if we believe it strongly enough. Okay, yeah, I get that. But watch this. Studies show, and they did this with research, if you are introduced with new information and for some reason you believe it's undeniably true, and I present you with 3 pieces of information from a particular source, and you believe that those pieces of information are undeniably true, then you'll automatically believe the 4th one. Now, this is research, cognitive bias, so there's going to be exceptions. You'll automatically believe the 4th thing from them, but the worst part is that it will take 11 iterations of counter facts or counter information for you to start doubting that source. And as long as the source every once in a while throws in some more undeniably true information, you could be locked in forever. It's kind of like that duck in psychology classes that would peck on this button, and when pecking on the button, it would give the duck food, and then if they stopped giving it food, the duck eventually stopped pecking on the button. But if the researchers went random and gave it food sometimes and didn't give it food other times, the duck would click that thing for the rest of its life. So that randomness that gets in there can create that. That's why you can have cults and conspiracy theories, because once they stop believing it, they believe everything else. And it's not that they're being mean or nasty or think, they just literally believe it. It's tied in. All right, now, pre-stimulus. Last week I talked about priming, and then we have beliefs and stories. The other thing I want to add, though, now we're going to look at it because I want to go to a new page and draw it a little bit differently. Over here we have our stimulus response bubble or cycle, right? We have the S, the R, and then the response. We have the cognitive biases in there, and we have the meta programs in there. And so this is a thing. And what's interesting is this thing is on the short end 750 milliseconds, and on the long end, let's call it 3 seconds. So 3,000 milliseconds on the long end. And that's arbitrary. I mean, I'm not a scientist, and we could talk about that. But the reason I put 3 seconds in there is because that gives enough time to assess. But then there's another part out here that's, I would call it 3 minutes, that I would still put as part of this. This whole thing is what I call the stimulus response cycle. This is my version of it. This is access to those powerful present moments that can change your life. There's about 65,000 seconds in your waking day. If you consider that there's sometimes more than one moment in a second, you can see that in a day, accessing the powerful present moment is the gateway to you changing your life. And the powerful present moment is not just that moment, it's the pre-stimulus, during the stimulus response, and then the post-stimulus response. And that post-stimulus response, I use it as 3 minutes, because after 3 minutes, it requires different work. Inside the 3 minutes, I can build this whole thing into a habit. This whole thing can be habitual. So when I talk about the automaticity of the subconscious, I'm talking about creating a stimulus response cycle that serves you, and that stimulus response cycle will be a few minutes. In the beginning, it could be a lot more. So we start with conditioning. The conditioning is way out here, right? That's where it really starts. We start with the condition. And this condition is where we are. Now, a person could be energized, they could be defeated, they could be stressed out, right? They could be on edge. There's all sorts of different adjectives for their condition. They could be rigid, they could be chaotic, but this has a lot to do with what happens over here, because if you're out of sorts over here, it's going to be harder to manage this. So we've got to come upstream and manage these things effectively. And then we have, this is where I started picking up last week, we have priming. We also have beliefs, and we have stories. Now, what's interesting is that this becomes a cycle. We also have the condition again. And by the way, priming can be internal and it can be external. I'm going to talk about this for a moment because it ties right back to that post that I mentioned. This loop that happens, if a person is too deep into this condition that doesn't serve them, and you're talking about leadership development and it comes around to behavior change, I expect this person to resist because they're not ready for it. If they don't want the thing that is going to get them, then why would they make the change? And if you're pushing the change on them, then you're doing exactly that, pushing the change on them. I'm going to talk about this for a minute because it's an important point. I want to talk about this condition thing. So we have our belief, and that belief has created a condition, and that condition has created, you could say, a result, an experience, but it creates something. Let's just call it a result for now. And that result reinforces the belief. Because of cognitive biases and all that, they talk about, am I already listening? This sometimes you get into this loop and you just can't break it because you just keep going back. And people, why do I always do that? Well, you always do it because you always do it. Well, why can't I stop doing it? Well, you can't stop doing it because you're always, it's like the loop. What I want to do first is let's go to another example where you have the belief and then you have, instead of the condition, you have the action. This is why they say action trumps everything. If you want to make a change, you start with action. You have to get up and do some things. I can make a very good case why getting up and taking a walk can actually interrupt your pattern. It has to do with the way the subconscious scans for threats when you go through a doorway or when you go into a new environment. Also shifting your attention. Sometimes you've been in situations where you're kind of stressing out and then something bigger, badder, crazier shows up and you focus on that and you can't even get back to the thing you were thinking about because this has your attention. So we can actually do that with habit. We can do that with habit. It's what happened with the positivity exercise as I talked about it this morning. And then we have action, which leads to a result, and that result reinforces the belief. So this you would say is a good loop. But I would say there's even a better loop. And that better loop would be, we have the belief, we have potential. The belief changes our potential. It changes what we think is possible. And this gets to the post about leadership and development. If the person doesn't see that there's potential out there, it makes it very difficult for me to try to change my behavior to get something that I don't believe exists. If I don't believe that something is available to me, then why am I going to go through the work that you're telling me will get there if I don't believe that's there? So the first thing we have to do is believe in the potential. When you believe in the potential, then you can take a different kind of action. And that action will get a different result. The other thing that came to mind with that post is that it's very easy to slip into being a victim without realizing it because we sugarcoat it, we dress it up with nice words. But a victim mentality is a victim mentality. And it just depends on how far upstream you want to go. If I'm a victim mentality because of my stimulus response and my subconscious, and that's the way I'm built, and that's the way I'm wired, and I was conditioned from 0 to 7, that may not sound like I'm being a victim, right? It may sound like I'm accepting the fact that human beings are this way. But now I'm giving you information about pre-stimulus, and if you research it, do your own testing and experimenting, and you come up with the same conclusions, and then you choose to ignore it, now you can see that you have no more right to complain because now you would be being a victim. So I think that that's a big part of it. So that's why I say start with purpose. There's a scene in the movie Black Hawk Down. And I like to look at Rangers, and I was an Army Ranger and I trained with Navy SEALs, and there's something different. You see it, right? I basically say that they broke the stimulus response cycle and replaced it with a different one. And that's not far off. There's a scene in there where if you haven't watched the movie, if you haven't seen the movie, where there's a helicopter down and they're trying to go blow up the helicopter, whatever it was, and they're trying to keep, and I think rescue the people who are trapped in it, and there was firefighting, there were enemy on the roofs, 1,000 of them, and there's only a handful, maybe a dozen of these rangers. And they went back out there and they got the people, and then they went back out there, I think it was then the second time, to blow up the helicopter, something like that. And there's a scene where they're getting ready to go back out. And one guy says, I'm ready to go back out with you. And the experienced person looks at him. Now, I don't know what was in that person's head that inspired that scene, but I will tell you, he probably saw, based on the facial expressions, he probably saw that this person didn't really believe that they would prevail, that he was going because it was his duty, but not the kind of duty that rises up, the kind of duty that makes you do something because you're obligated. He was obligated to go back out. So he said, I'm ready to go back out. Now they only have 5 or 6 soldiers going back out there this time. And there's 1,000 enemy on the roofs. They have the advantage, but yet they were going into this and he's willing to not take this extra body. Very, very important point, because he saw that the person didn't have enough why to do it. Now, what's the big why the other ones had? They've accepted that this is who they are, that they will make it happen. And that replaces, I guess, the why, or you could argue that is a why. Anyway, thought I'd put that in there because I think too often we skip that whole part of it and we let people be victims and then try to give them solutions that require agency. You can't take on a solution that requires agency if you're in a victim mentality. Now you have belief and my potential changes. I take action, and now I get a different result because I took a different action, because I have the potential. I believe those things are available to me, and now my belief changes. See, and then the belief can change and get bigger and bigger. So there's different ways that you could describe that. The other thing I want to talk about is, I talked about condition. People have heard it said, if you're in coaching, you probably said it yourself, that you can't get to a place, you can't design a great solution from a place of lack or a place of fear. I'm going to lean into that a little bit deeper. So if we take this idea of coherence, and for this example, you can make coherence be whatever you want it to be. But just think about heart, mind coherence. And this just could be, your mindset coherence. Just when they're incoherent, I should say. And when they're incoherent, the part that's coherent is moving along well. It can even impact health. And then you have the incoherence. And the incoherence creates rigidity and chaos, sometimes at the same time. I hate everything that's going on. I can't do anything about it. I'm not going to move. I hate where I am, but I'm not going to move. I can't, sometimes just at the same time. And then I have this view that says, if you focus too much on the rigidity and the chaos, what we focus on expands. And if it expands, that leaves less room for coherence. And so now you have very little coherence and you have a lot of incoherence. And this is what I'm using this as an example to say condition. So it's not technically, you're not going to see this in a medical book or anything. It's not technically accurate. But when I'm in the context of this stimulus response cycle, I would say that's the condition I'm talking about. And that's why we have this loop. And that's why I went to those examples, because your belief creates your stories and your stories reinforce your belief. And then priming could reinforce all of that or take you even deeper. And you have external priming and internal priming, and then that creates the condition. And in order to break out of the condition, you have to take some action. So a lot of times with a client, if they're stuck here, if my best client is the person who's tried everything. They've tried everything, they've just given up. Because I'll use those words with them when things get stuck, because the inner work is hard. It's scary. It's not hard, physically hard or difficult. It's just scary because it's the unknown. And the subconscious looks at the unknown as a Serengeti tiger. So it's like every day you're like having to face this tiger and you get tired. You get tired of facing this tiger, even though every day when you reach out to touch the tiger, it dissolves. Soon you stop reaching out to touch it because you just are aware of it and you become aware and it dissolves. And then eventually you get to the point where you just ignore it And then you just notice it's just a data point. The Serengeti tigers are just data points. So that's what happens in this loop. And this is not a shameless plug. It is a shameless plug, but it's not meant to be that. That's why when the client pays for the coaching, they're already probably halfway there. Now they need the tools and the resources. But that is the action that shifts this whole thing towards the condition being better. The thing I should say about the internal and external priming is that you have to be aware that everything is atoms. If you accept quantum physics view of the world as opposed to Newtonian physics, everything is atoms. And the same way we are, that's sort of how our cells are. So if you work in an organization, the internal environment of the organization is your external environment. And we respond to our external environment. Put you into a cold climate, you acclimate, right? Put you into high altitude, you acclimate. We respond to our external environment. It makes sense when people talk about it, the physical. They don't realize it happens at the minute level in energy as well. Take it a step further. Our internal environment, which could be toxic because of the stress, because of the kind of foods we eat, lack of sleep, whatever, our internal environment is the external environment of our cells. The cells are supposed to be going after nutrients. That's what's keeping us alive, right, and thriving. So let's say the external environment becomes so toxic. What happens to the people in that organization? Right? Their performance goes down. They start to check out. They don't have the resistance. They get sick, all these things. What happens if your internal environment is toxic? The cells shut down. So they've shown that cells have two configurations. One configuration when they're going after nutrients, think about eating and growing, and another configuration when they're in protective mode. So when there's threats around them, the cell goes into protective mode. Why? So it can live to eat another day. What's interesting is it can't go after nutrients when it's in protective mode. So now that's why you can see that shutting down creates more and more and more problems. So if you're in a toxic environment and your body, that's your external environment, you respond and become a different kind of a person, and that creates toxicity inside. Now your cells are shutting down and you're not getting the nutrients you need, and that creates more stress. And now your brain is starting to leach from other organs to make sure it gets what it needs. And you can see why people say that you can create your own illnesses. And that's a way of looking at it. And again, you could research this, Google it, come up with your own version. But what I'm telling you is backed up by research, by peer-reviewed research. And that's what I look for. I look at peer-reviewed research. Then I look at it against my own experience. And then I look at it against the Bible. And not that to make this a religious conversation, but the Bible has stood the test of time. I can tell you that over and over and over, it's proven to be right. So that becomes my other pillar of research, if you will. And I'm not suggesting it be yours, but my point is use research to make your decision with the references. That's why I started with this conversation, that if I'm going to change somebody's behaviors, it's not about me changing their values and behaviors. That's not what I want to do. I want to present them with the references and enable them to have leadership and agency. And then they decide based on the references what they want their beliefs, values, and attitudes to be. And that's what designing your life comes down to. So I talked about last week that we should come up with a belief that's kind of minor, and one that's been holding you back, the ones that's been getting in your way, and we're going to do something with it. Because we started talking about the power of words, but look where belief is. Belief is way over here on the continuum or on the path, and it's impacting condition, and it's your conditioning. So if we come way back to the beginning and we're talking about belief way over here, you can see why I'm starting with belief. So this exercise is to help you look at belief in the context of references. So for example, I can tell you that I can change my heart rate. I was having surgery, and because of my background in martial arts and all, I used to play this game with myself whenever I was hooked up to one of these machines, and I would change my heart rate. So if I tell you that I can change my heart rate up and down. You may or may not believe that. But then if I can show you references of why it's possible, or better yet, if I ask you, what references do you have that tell you it's not true? And you don't have any references. See, by talking about the references, we can then change a belief. And this is why once you do this work, awareness alone can be enough to make the shift, because you're now doing it with agency. I'm going to come back to the heart rate because it's an important point. Imagine that you have this belief, and I want you to frame it up. I want you to put it into a statement that it's something that when I do this, this happens, or when I want to do this, or I take steps to do that, something happens, or I'm prevented from doing it, or there's something external that happens. Whatever that belief is, I just want you to have that kind of a statement. And you don't know where it's coming from. You've asked yourself multiple times, why do I do this? I don't know why I do this. Why does this always happen to me? That kind of a belief, but nothing major, nothing existential, just something minor. So now you have that sentence in your mind, or make a note of it. I want you to imagine that you're walking into a movie theater. And as you walk into the movie theater, you notice that the screen is on your right. There's a projection booth up there on the left, but nobody's in the theater. So you don't know what this is about. So you go and sit in the center of the movie theater, right in the center, and you're looking at the screen, and the screen is blank. And then you get an instruction that says to float out of yourself, leave yourself there in the center of the movie theater, and float out of yourself and float up into the projection booth and wait for instructions. So now you go up to the projection booth, and you're watching yourself watch the screen. Watching yourself watch the screen. And then you get the instruction to turn on the projector. And the projector says this is going to be your life, and you are going to start running through your life, and notice the first time that you remember experiencing that belief first came to your awareness. So you're going to run through the movie, through your life as a movie, and you're looking for the first time that belief showed up. Maybe it's the first time you formed it. Maybe it's when it was given to you. Maybe it's the first time you became aware of it. And note that point. And then go on with your life and note the next point that belief came up. The next time that belief comes up, note it. Notice what's around it. Now stop the film from the projection booth. Remember, you're watching yourself watch yourself. And you should have 2 data points where that belief showed up. Turn off the projector and come back down to yourself. Now you can leave all that there, because you can come back to this theater anytime you want to look at things from your past life. And I want you to answer the questions for yourself. What was around you at that time? Who was there? What was the source of that belief? Who were the collaborators? Who were the corroborators? What were the other things that were around you telling you that this belief was true? So for example, for me believing I could change my heart rate, my references, the things that were around me, were other martial artists who were telling me. It was actually seeing people with instruments measuring their heart rate while people were meditating, and I could see them slow their heart rate down into the 40s and then speed it up into the 80s. So I had a belief that did it, and so I was able to act on that belief, and it gets back to I had the belief that the potential was there, and then you could do the actions, and then you get the result, and then you can keep doing that loop. So I want you to notice what was around you. Now that source, the information, the corroborators and collaborators, those become references. Now I want you to look at the references. Were the references definite experts for that information, or was it just somebody telling you? Where was it on that continuum? Was it just some random thought? Was it maybe a grandparent who said this is the way life is? Or maybe it's just something you read. Maybe it was in a comic book. Whatever those sources were, I want you to identify them. And then ask yourself, knowing what you know now, are those references strong enough for you to have this belief? And before you answer that question, now what we have is we have a belief that something is not available to us, and it's why we trip over things, or we feel like it's self-sabotage, but it's not. And that belief, we've now stacked other things on it. So on top of this belief, we've stacked some things, because that's what you do with beliefs, and you stack other things on it. So now we have these references, or the legs, and it's hard to change a belief because we've got these things stacked on it. But what's interesting is if the references are weak enough, it's like court, and the attorney is looking to discredit the witness. if I can discredit their references to the point where you don't think that they are references anymore or valid, then the references have to fall, the belief has to fall. But before the belief falls, what you can do is give yourself another set of beliefs so you can now offload those blocks or whatever you've built and stacked up. You can offload them. Now, I'm showing it here as a thing that's taking a minute or two, but when you've done the work, just the awareness that you have to change a belief, this happens in an instant. It's one of those moments that it changes everything in an instant, and now you have a new set of beliefs or a new belief that's on new references. That is the exercise that you can use to go back and look at your existing beliefs. And I would start with the mild things where you've said to yourself, I don't know why I always do that. Why do I like chocolate candy so much? Why do I eat chocolate candy when I'm stressed out? And we can keep, now I wouldn't overdo it, but just take it, go slow with it. Don't look for a panacea. Don't expect it to be and it's just giving you a data point, because what we're doing is we are actually going to introduce some things to you. So there's 2 or 3 beliefs that I'm going to ask you to consider, at least as we go through these series. The reason I talked about the heart rate, and I wanted to use that as an example, is because epigenetics is literally the influence we have over our gene expression. So there's roughly 20,000 genes. That number's gone up and down from 19,000 to 23,000, depending on what research. But the combinations of all those different genes is how placebos work. It's how nocebos work. It's why in ancient times somebody could cast a spell on somebody, at least this is what I think, and the spell works. And then because they had so much belief that spell was it, that the inner system changed, that gene expression can actually heal. This is why the mystics talk about healing. You're literally changing the genes. And if placebo can get the results of a prescription pill that you believe, why wouldn't that placebo be able to cure some ailment that you have? So I've used this to experiment with myself, chronic injuries, snowboarding injuries, whatever, motorcycle injuries that just were persistent and causing pain. And I was able to get rid of it using, and this work isn't about epigenetics. That's not what it's about. But it's about the fact that gene expression can actually do these things. So that's one. So epigenetics, and the reason I'm not going to talk about epigenetics, but to suspend disbelief until we get through it. Because a person may believe that they have a curse on them, or their family's cursed, or because they were born into this system, or they were born at this time, or in this part of the world, that things aren't available to them. Suspend your disbelief that it's not genes, it's because genes change with the internal environment, and that's what epigenetics is about. So if you suspend belief there, it will allow you to put this fact or this thought that you have some curse or some external thing. It allows you to put that aside. And that's why I talked about changing the heart rate, because there's a very simple version. The point is you can actually change that internal condition. The next belief that I'll ask you, or next disbelief that I'll ask you to suspend, is that the subconscious is not a mind. This to me is the huge milestone in getting the breakthrough. When I was talking about the stimulus or the reaction equaling the response, and I was talking about how people double down on the decision that they make, when you can see that the stimulus response is not you, that this is the conscious mind the conscious mind is at play over here, this is the subconscious. When you can accept that the subconscious is not a mind, it's a network of neurons, and you look at it as a separate thing, and it is a thing, and I use the example, if a person dies, their mind is gone, their spirit is gone, their soul is gone, but the network of neurons is still there. The energy that was flowing through those neurons is gone, but the neurons are still there, the brain is still there. So of the 100 billion neurons, 86 billion are in the brain. Another 14 billion are in the body. If there's 100 billion of anything in one space, there's not room for much else. So I literally will start most of my assessments with what's going on with the neurons, because it's that clear cut once you see it. So I want you to suspend disbelief, because if you want to see the subconscious as a mind, then a lot of the other things I talk about won't be plausible, because you're looking at the subconscious as a mind. I don't give it that much credit. You'll hear, if you watch all my content, I never call it a mind. It's the subconscious. So the subconscious is, by definition, sub is below. Conscious mind is here, and then we have the higher self. So that was what we did today. That was all about you getting access to your beliefs. But remember, this is about agency. It's not about you adopting a belief that somebody wants you to have. It's about getting the agency so you can make those decisions. And I would say start with purpose. Start with purpose, and then take action to make sure that that purpose is meaningful enough to you. Make it bigger than yourself. Coaches speed things up. Coaches give you insights. Coaches can give you the perspectives that you may not be seeing. So I'm going to leave it there. It will be in my live events. Last week's is in my live events, and you can watch that one to get the piece about setting up the belief thing and the stimulus response. And then next week, we'll get into the vocabulary, speaking specifically about transformational vocabulary and why words have so much power, why they're like our internal priming, how they interact with other people's external priming, and how words actually can create our condition for good or for bad. So we'll see you then. Take care.